Hello and welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. My name is Morag. This podcast is an initiative of the Permaculture Education Institute, and through our online permaculture education program, we teach permaculture teachers around the world and host global permaculture conversations and learning communities. This is a really special episode. It's my way of celebrating the late Graham Bell, permaculture elder, pioneer, forest gardener, teacher, mentor, author, father, husband, friend. He died earlier this month after a brief illness, and I joined the permaculture community around the world in acknowledging his incredible contribution to this field and to teaching permaculture teachers on 6 continents. I send my deepest condolences to his family. I actually recorded this episode late last year and have been trying to work out how to edit it. Graham and I talked for almost 2 hours. I thought I needed to edit it to about an hour, but I couldn't work out which stories to leave out. They were all full of rich nuggets of information and wisdom. So in the end, I've decided to simply share the whole conversation with you here. Since our focus here at the Permaculture Education Institute is about teaching permaculture teachers, I was curious to talk with Graham about his insights and experiences as an educator. And oh my, really, what richness is within. Graham is an avid storyteller and says often throughout this conversation how important this is to education. Graham has also published 2 books, both permaculture classics, The Permaculture Way, Practical Steps to Create Self-Sustaining World, and The Permaculture Garden. And as I mentioned before, the Sense Making a Changing World podcast is an initiative of the Permaculture Education Institute. You can find out more about our permaculture education program in the show notes below, and I'm also including links to Graham's website and his books there. So check out those links down in the show notes. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from which I'm speaking with you today, the land of the Gubbi Gubbi, and pay my deep respect to their elders past and present. I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging story from Graham Bell. You can listen in on your favourite podcast app or watch on our podcast YouTube too. Check out the show notes for the different versions. So thank you to Graham Bell for all that he's done for permaculture in the world and for taking the time to sit with me and explore permaculture education here. The world is going to miss a wonderful permaculture teacher. I hope you thoroughly enjoy listening to Graham's story, spanning decades and the globe. Well, welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World show, Graham. For the listeners here today, my guest on the show is Graham Bell, who has been involved in permaculture for decades, considered one of the elders of the permaculture movement, and has taught on 6 continents. He just told me before that he's never been invited to Antarctica, but he's been teaching around the world. He lives in Scotland, in the midst of a food forest that he's created over the last few decades with his family. He's an author of a couple of books, The Permaculture Way and The Permaculture Garden. And one of the reasons why I wanted to invite and speak with Graham here today is because of his role in permaculture education, because this podcast is all about permaculture education, because we're beaming out from the Permaculture Education Institute. This is one of the key focuses. So welcome to the show, Graham. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi. So I'm just being a frog today. I'm sitting out in the grass with the dew on it. And if I pop my cheeks out, you'll see. Okay. Connection with living things has always been important to me. When I was a child, I grew up on Royal Air Force stations. My father was the longest serving member of the Royal Air Force there'll ever be. He joined as an apprentice at 15 and trained as a toolmaker. Went with the Chindits into Burma, ended up in the Andaman Islands when the first women came out of Japanese prisoner of war camps and were kept there till they were fit to be shown to the world. So people of his generation never talked about that stuff, you know. But one thing I suppose came out of that for me was when he talked about the Royal Air Force, he always called it the service. He was compulsorily retired at 67 when he was still taking cadets. So, 52 years in one job is what you would call service, That's how he saw it. And I think that stayed with me. Growing up in the 1950s and 1960s in Britain, we were misled by our parents, who had themselves been misled into thinking that we lived in a country with universal adult literacy, that corruption was some nasty thing that happened in far-off places like Nigeria or somewhere, not here, that you didn't go to Spain on holiday because the streets were so dirty, unlike Britain. And that we lived in a fair and just society. It's a bit of a disappointment over the years to discover that this is just a fabrication. And when we went to school, every classroom had a map on the wall in which half the world was pink because we owned it. Well, of course, we never did. And that, again, was something that you sort of learn as you go forward through life. But we were taught very much that yourself comes last. You're supposed to look after other people first. So here's step one in training teachers to venture into the permaculture world, and something I wish I'd realized 30 years earlier, which is this is nonsense. If you don't look after yourself, how are you going to look after other people? So it's turning that thing on its head to see that it's not selfishness to put yourself first, but it's common sense, because then you're in a better position to be of service to other people. And in those days, Saturday morning, you got thrown out the house after breakfast, come back at lunchtime. You got a sandwich or something, you got thrown out of the house again, told to come back at tea time. So we spent huge parts of our lives out in the countryside on a bicycle, often. Age 7, we would cycle 12 miles a night or something like that, day, sorry. But, that direct exposure to the world around us was stunning. There was a guy called John T. Newbold who lived next door to me at that age, who was a fantastic naturalist, aged 7. We would find caterpillars, and most of us had got a little mouse cage from having a pet mouse at some point. We would put the caterpillars in there with whatever it was they ate and watch them turn into chrysalis. And then when they hatched in the spring, we'd let them go and so on. And everywhere my parents went, living in married quarters, they would create a garden. Now, typically you would have a house with a bit of lawn and so on. What most people did in the forces just mowed the grass, because it wasn't their thing, and you had to keep it tidy or the station commander would be around shouting at you, Everywhere my parents went, my father grew vegetables and my mother made flower gardens. And that you get moved on every 2-3 years, and they did that over and over again. I remember aged not very much, 8 or something, being told that if I dug up the dandelions from the lawn, I'd get a penny for every dandelion I dug up. What they didn't appreciate is I used a silver fork from the cutlery canteen, which became irreparably damaged at some point. So it cost them a lot more than a penny a dandelion, I suppose. In time, of course, one learns to love dandelions and understand how useful they are. That early experience meant you had your hands in the soil. There's a bacterium in the soil called Mycobacillus vaccae, V-A-C-C-A-E, from the Latin for cattle, so called because the first people to consciously breed this bacterium in Austria did it on cow dung. This remarkable creature, when you touch it, it causes your brain to release serotonin. If you don't believe me, go on the internet and look up Leeds University and Bristol University in England, who have both done research and agree on the matter that this is what happens. So throw away the happy pills and get your hands in the soil. Um, it's this kind of direct experience that I think is something that is most valuable in permaculture. Now, I, for my sins, studied Old English and linguistics at Oxford University, and I have a master's degree for what it's worth. Oxford University, let me reassure you, is not an institute of education. It's an institute of class training. It's where the people who think they run the country go to, with places like Cambridge and so on. The reality is that there are a whole other set of people who really run the country, who are some layers above, senior civil servants and so on. And that's a global phenomenon. One of my great griefs in the last few years has been that in, I think, 1921, the billionaires in the world got 28% richer in 5 months funding COVID.
Mm.
Hey ho.
Mm.
So I started out after university working in the construction industry, trained as a company secretary, got fed up with being stuck in an office when it was sunny. When it got to the point when I got fed up of being stuck in an office when it was raining, I thought it was time to move on. So I retrained in the birth of the micro revolution as a computer salesman. And I was working in the City of London. That's a very interesting exposure, because alongside the mega corporations, there are masses of tiny little businesses squeezed in, all kinds of things. And that really was my speciality, not blue chips, but, SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises. And because I had done all this company secretarial work and so on, I actually knew how businesses worked, whereas a lot of the computer sales people around me didn't have a clue. They just were out to try and get rich quick. And I got made sales manager, having been most successful salesman in the UK at my class level. I trained with Philips Industries, but I worked with dealerships in the city. And that was the route things were going. Computer manufacturers were going to stop selling things direct and work through a wider distribution network. And I discovered that actually I didn't have a clue how to be a sales manager. So I went on a training course at my own request, and that my boss very kindly funded it. And then I thought, no, I don't want to be in this company anymore. These little family businesses, rubbish. And went off and worked for a US training company, who were one of the first people in online computer training. And I was a total failure because blue chips aren't my thing. And it was mostly aimed at mainframe folks. So I came out of that, and my then wife said, that's all right. You don't have to work. I earn enough for both of us. You can finish doing up the house. So that's what I set off to do. Halfway through that first year, I got a place to go and retrain as an electrical engineer on a TOPS course. This is an unemployed program. And that's what I did. And so in 9 months, I came out as a qualified electrical engineer, very intensive, by which time my wife had decided to leave me. And that was horrific, until 3 months later, when I was going to send postcards to the guy who was my best mate that she ran off with, saying, thank you very much, please don't come back. Because a whole new world opened up for me, which I hadn't been expecting. And I joined the Green Party during that time. I stood for Parliament, amongst other things. And I invented green fairs, which still carry on all over the world. And the first one we ran was in a place called Deptford in southeast London, a very working class area, very close to the River Thames. And we had the most amazing time. We got all the other political parties to turn out. We had stages with music going on. We had great food going on. And we had the widest possible exposure to a whole range of ideas to do with all this. Now, during this time, I had a very good friend, Joe Steranka, who was on the Standing Orders Committee with me. We're the reason it's called the Green Party now. It used to be called the Ecology Party, And there was a motion to change the name, which was defeated at conference until I pointed out, having actually read Law of Meetings, to the chair that it's not the way people vote that determines the sense of the meeting, it's what the chair decides. So I suggested take the vote again, and when he did, it was passed. So Green Party, all of that. During this time, I met up with my present wife, Nancy, who had done a doctorate in Aberdeen in biochemistry and kind of run away screaming because this was just the pharmaceutical industry funding people, in her case, to find a cure for cancer. She was a very keen cyclist. She was also involved in the Green Party in Aberdeen in Scotland. And she'd helped re-establish otters on the River Dee, for example. She once cycled from Aberdeen to Lisbon. I think she was allowed to use a boat to cross the channel.
Hope so.
So she ended up getting a job for the London Cycling Campaign, which is how I connected with her, helping people establish better cycle practice, encouraging cycle routes, training people. She was the first female Dr. Bike in London, teaching women to do their own cycle maintenance and so on. And one day we decided to start a family. So our daughter Ruby was born at home in London 34 years ago. And we decided we didn't want to bring up a child in a big city. And we wanted to be part of a community. And we met up with some other people who were into cycling stuff. And we ended up moving to where we are now in the Scottish borders in 1988. We bought a whole load of buildings and did them up together, which worked fine till about 3 years down the line when basically everybody fell out with everybody else and it ceased being a community. They went away, we stayed here. Don't need to go into all that just now, but why permaculture? Well, visiting Jo Steranka, she went out to a political meeting for the evening and left me with her library and a flagon of Peapod wine. The Peapod wine was disgusting. I subsequently made some myself and it was even worse. But the library was very interesting. And I ended up with just 2 books that I was looking at, and I was flitting between them. The first was called The Findhorn Garden. It's the story of the intentional community on the Moray Firth coast in Scotland, which was founded around meditation as a key principle. The lovely Dorothy, who was part of the setup originally, spoke with plant divas. Now, amazing book. The original version I commend to you, which is all black and white photography. There's a modern version, which is colour photography, and I don't think it's nearly as striking. It's a beautiful read. And alongside that was a copy of the first edition of Permaculture 1, which looked as if it was printed on recycled toilet paper and had drawings that my subsequently 5-year-old children could do better than, of lollipop trees and things.
Graham, both those books I grew up with. They were part of my mum and dad's library, and they were what I was introduced to with permaculture. It's so funny that those 2 you mentioned. I know exactly the editions you're talking about. I have them here in my library now.
Very good. So the thing was, as I flit between the 2 books, you know, the Findhorn Garden was saying we're fantastic people, but you can't do this. Essentially, I'm sure they never intended it to say that, but there weren't any lessons on how to speak with plant divas, you know. And when Bill Mollison visited there, a plastic bag blew through one of the flower beds, and he said, "Oh, look, there goes a fairy." He wouldn't have it at all. He thought they were completely nuts, which they weren't. And you know, they've done a lot of good work over the years, but it wasn't an enabling process. And the thing was, Permaculture 1 told me about all the things I cared about in one place. So we were talking about the importance of gardening, growing food, how much trees matter, about how we need to manage water well. There's a fantastic illustration in it of a solid fuel stove which does everything. I could reassure you that Permaculture 1 was a design, it wasn't an actuality, and that this stove would never actually work because it's trying to do too many things. But it was a great idea, and I just felt inspired. And all this book was saying to me is, you can do this. Mm. So that's how I got into it. And Nancy and I went on the first permaculture weekend in the UK, run by Andy Langford and Jolyon Fillingham. I never know what happened to Jolyon Fillingham. Andy Langford these days runs the Guy University in US and Mexico, which leaves me as the longest standing teacher in the UK. I started teaching that was an introductory weekend. When we moved to Scotland, that first August, there was the first full permaculture design course in Devon, run by Andy, and Nancy and I went to that with Babe in arms. So Ruby is one of the oldest permaculture graduates in the UK at the age of 6 months. That was us on the road. And by the following year, we taught a course here, which I think Andy came and helped us with. And then 1990, I set off on my own. There was one other person teaching us with us at the time, Stephen Nutt, who doesn't teach anymore, but he's still around. He's very involved in Bach flower remedy production, south coast of England. And I've been teaching ever since then. So that's 32 years now. And that was the same year that Bill gave me a diploma on build system, which is you ticked all the boxes for which categories you claim to have done. And I think I ticked about 6 out of 8 because I was producing Permaculture News, title taken over by Jeff Lawton later on, replaced here by Permaculture magazine some years ago. And off we went. After about 5 years of teaching PDCs, permaculture design courses, I stopped. It seemed like every time you taught a course, everybody started teaching themselves. Now, I got, 20 years, no, not that long, 15 years experience in industry, commerce. I'd been gardening for years. I'd grown up in the outside environment, but suddenly we had people who were 19 or 20 who decided they could teach a permaculture design course. Maybe they could. The problem was a lot of people, you see, this stuff is so inspiring that people feel they want to share it with other people straight away, which is Bill wound them up to do, as opposed to David Holmgren going away and saying, I need to prove this works first, and spending 20 years doing so. Bill was a fantastic raconteur, and because he was so well informed and so funny and so engaging, he managed to teach effectively. David has kind of admitted that teaching isn't really his thing, and I admire his honesty with that. David is a much more cerebral person. His work is absolutely fantastic, but I constantly meet people who tell me they've read his magnum opus, and I doubt most of them, to be honest. It takes me a week to read one chapter. It's so dense and so detailed. Most of them know the diagram, which David didn't make, of the principles and so on. And that's the thing that stuck with them, and it's very useful. So I went off and did other things. I ran the Prince's Trust in Edinburgh for 6 years. I worked with over 1,000 young people, 18 to 25, and some folks with access difficulties, as we are supposed to say these days, who are older than that. I had previously, running an electrical contracting business, done a lot of work with retired people. So, and with the cycling business, we worked a lot of people with, again, physical disabilities. So all of this was introducing me to a number of key aspects of EDGE, as we might call it. 12% of people in Britain are registered disabled. That doesn't count the ones who are disabled but aren't registered, you know. This idea that, perfectly toned male physique and, beautiful women is the norm, which is constantly propagated in advertising. I love the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement has transformed that in the UK. People were talking about the connection with recognizing the value of people of color. And, we were engaged with that from the very first Green Fair we made, because London is a very diverse community, one of the most diverse in the world, and we had a lot of exposure to it. This guy called Philip Peacejoy, who'd been with the Hare Krishnas, who went on to become the first black candidate for Parliament for the Green Party in the UK. So there's a lot of involvement with these lots of different sectors of society. And so a key thing that I try to get across day one when training trainers is it's not up to you to be the cleverest person in the room. You are the cleverest person in the room when everybody else thinks they are. And I came to this because I trained in the 1990s with the Agricultural Training Board, as then was in the UK, as a trainer. And I subsequently went on to become a trainer of trainers with them. Today, the organization's called Lantra. But the first thing they tell you is, you can't tell farmers anything. So you're trained to get the people you're teaching to tell you what you wanted to teach them. So one of the greatest gifts we have is open questions. Rudyard Kipling in The Elephant's Child wrote, "There are 6 honest serving men and true. They taught me all I knew. Their how and why and when and what and where and who." These are all open questions. When you ask these questions, you can't respond with yes or no. You have to give information. Yes or no questions are called closed questions, and sometimes that's what you need when you seek agreement, when you're trying to close a deal, when you're trying to tell somebody, no, you can't do that, But this became an exploration for me, and I came back, I think 2006, I stopped working in Edinburgh. And during that time, I'd been engaged by Chambers of Commerce to do press and policy work for Scottish Chambers of Commerce, for Edinburgh Chamber of Commerce. I later went on to become chair of the Federation of Small Businesses in this region. Press and policy. Policy is a crucial thing. And I never once used the word permaculture. But we were doing permaculture with industry. And it was this, I discovered there's this wonderful kind of, I don't know whether it's a triangle or a square or a star or what, but you've got the general public, you've got the media, and you've got politicians, the 3 points of that object, whatever it is. And it's once you can connect all 3 together, you have the medium to educate and to move people on and to get them to change their perspective, and that's really what permaculture does. It's about learning to see things differently. So the first thing we do is we unlearn. Western education has a lot to answer for, and has unfortunately been copied right across the world, in the Far East even. And it's the idea that there are facts and they're right. And actually, I don't pretend to be a scientist. I know a bit about electricity, I know a bit about biology and so on, but I don't pretend to be a scientist. So what I'm trying to do is teach citizen science. The way I would look at it is this. In our culture, in Western Europe, way back when, we had alchemists. These were probably the first scientists de facto, who were trying to make gold out of lead and things like that, which sounds totally impossible, but we now know, of course, it's exactly what the sun does, is to change metals and so on. So it's not entirely impossible. However, nobody ever succeeded in doing it that I know of. Beyond that, we started to get this new generation of people called herbalists. And this was people like Culpeper, and there's a whole lineage went through this to Linnaeus and the binomial system, which he's credited with. He didn't invent it, he just improved it. And of course, one of the things that got forgotten is the extent to which this knowledge actually came from wise women in the first place, and that midwifery was in the hands of such women. And these are the same people who started to get burnt as witches. There are so many awful things in our history which you and I are not responsible for, but they still weigh heavily on us. What has been done to indigenous people in many parts of the world, as we were spreading pink everywhere, and we weren't the only people doing it out of UK. I love going to Australia and going down to down the coast from Perth, where we were at the International Convergence in 2016. And we came out of Perth, which is in the middle of Scotland. We went through High Wycombe, which is where I went to school in Buckinghamshire, and so on down the road, and passing Scarborough and Cambridge, and all in the wrong order. And in between, there are Aboriginal names all the way. It's people who are lonely for home, who were often shipped involuntarily to other parts of the world. And then they did things like call something a bluebell. And there's an Australian bluebell, there's a New Zealand bluebell, there's a South African bluebell, there's a Canadian bluebell. People missing home and finding a blue flower in the spring and wanting to be reminded of it. So, along with diversity of genders, diversity of skin color, diversity of culture, diversity of climate, we have this great system that we can share with people. And I find there are three main reasons people come on permaculture courses. Number one, they want to go homesteading. And a lot of Bill's original description of permaculture is based on the Australian experience. It's relatively easy to go find yourself 50 acres, 100 acres, hectares these days in Australia, and do pretty much what you like with it. Yes, there are planning laws, but there's nothing like the planning laws in this country. And, there's some great things in it. In Western Australia, you have to have X amount of water storage, so you're going to be secure in a drought. But there are other things which are not so relevant here or possible here. It's really difficult to get yourself 5 acres in this country because we are dominated by vast landowners, and you can't get planning permission unless you have something like 25 hectares, because that's considered enough to earn a living off. I know somebody who earns a living off a quarter of an acre making walking sticks out of hazel. It's just nonsense, but it's the way things go here. So all that stuff about zonation, for example, which makes absolute sense if you've got 100 acres in somewhere nice in Australia, and preferably got your own billabong and all that stuff, start making dams, etc., etc. Most people's the zone 3 here is in the supermarket down the street, So the principles need adaptation, and one of the things that comes out of this, I said commercial industrial agriculture earlier, one of the things to be critical about here is please don't call it conventional agriculture. It's not. What we've been doing is not using chemicals for thousands of years. When Justus von Liebig discovered NPK as the major nutrients in soil, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, he also said, and there's lots of lesser chemicals in the soil, which are also important. The one thing he didn't say is actually a living soil produces all these things, and does so better year on year if you husband it right. And as Masanobu Fukuoka, the great Japanese agronomist, said, farming is about growing people long before it's about growing food. And I think this is the beauty of permaculture to me. It is and always has been about people. And some people talk about that as if that's a recent discovery, but it's not. Go read the Permaculture Designer's Manual. It's in there. It's in all the permaculture books I've ever come across. And then we've got people like Terry Lee who've been critical of where we've come with all of that, quite rightly so. But what we are trying to do is provide for all human needs as well as possible, as equitably as possible, as quickly as possible, in a way that doesn't yet predominate. And in doing that, to ensure the right of all living creatures and plants on planet Earth to exist. There are no such things as bad plants or bad creatures. They all have a place in the world of nature, and they have a role. And so permaculture actually doesn't give you any answers at all. And that's the second thing people come looking for is, I want the answer. Well, I can't give you the answer for you. Many permaculture teachers talk about empowering people. I've never empowered anyone. The only person I can empower is me. What we can do is we can create the right habitat in which people can learn to empower themselves. And nobody gets it all right. We all make mistakes. I worry about people who don't make mistakes because they're not trying to do anything new. Try not to keep making the same mistakes and try not to make fatal mistakes, and then you don't get another chance. But we'll all notice that we in ourselves, if we're honest, and we'll see it in other people, have some mistakes that take us longer to learn than others. The Jesuits say, give me a boy till he's 7 and he's mine for life. This is actually true of all people. We tend to be made who we are by the time we're 7. It's our early childhood which forms us. That doesn't mean to say we can't change, but it does mean that we all have particular things that we struggle with. Probably most of us have met the man who's been married 4 or 5 times and thinks women are the problem, doesn't understand that relationships need to be managed in a certain way, and so on,
Can I ask you about your family experience, because your children have grown up within a permaculture context? Can you describe a bit about their experience of that, or what you've noticed of their experience, because that's helped to inform and shape who they are? And what do you notice there?
I'm sure they'd be much better at answering that.
I'm sure they would. Yeah, sorry.
But forgive me if I'm saying things that they would never thank me for. My daughter Ruby was, like a lot of teenagers, quite challenging growing up. She ran away from home at 15, came back at 16. Learning cycle for me too about what doesn't work. She went to Lincoln University and studied. She was going to do graphic design and illustration, turned it into studying creative advertising, which is copywriting as well as illustrating, because somebody told her that was a better course to do. And then along came economic collapse, so that there weren't any jobs in advertising. Came home, worked for me for a week, and then turned up on the Saturday and told me she was pregnant with her bloke who she'd been with since she was 15 and so on. But she'd basically come home from university pregnant, obviously. And so she went off, had baby, didn't want to come back and work for me. She now works in the green shop in Berwick, described by the Guardian newspaper as green as Robin Hood's underpants. And, and they're they've been trying to turn it into a co-op so that the present owners could retire. Hasn't quite worked out, but she's very committed to all of this. And And she's got an 11-year-old son now who's great, and her partner is the sexton in Berwick. And that's the guy who makes sure the graveyards run well and people get buried decently. And so, them, in their own ways, they're both doing special work, which is very caring for other people. The Green Shop sells food and also ethically produced clothing and ornaments, gifts, and things, and so on. And Sandy, our son, was born 2 years later at home here in Coldstream, and he's a research guy at Leeds University. His speciality is air quality. He's an environmental chemist, and he's the immediate past president of the Permaculture Association in Britain, from which he retired at the ripe old age of 31. He's 32 now. He's married, and Ruthie has just got her doctorate, and she's now working at the Museum of Photography in Bradford, in West Yorkshire. That's where they live. And so in their own ways, as I think Sandy sort of says, well, he kind of went away from it and came back in his mid-20s. So when I was running the Prince's Trust and I finished, people said to me, how do you get all these people to do what you want? Young people, how do you get them to do what you want? I'd worked with over 1,000 young people, and the answer is, well, you don't. You're trying to help them do what they want, I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that I would persuade people to do what I wanted. That wasn't the point of the exercise. And interestingly, talking about different abilities, I would guess something like half the people I worked with were dyslexic. And as with many disabilities, it's not the person who's disabled. It's society which is disabled not to be able to accommodate them and whatever it is they need in their lives. So we are all differently able. And I think the third thing that people come on courses for, doing the Billy Connolly thing, you see, coming back to the story. The third thing people come back for is professionalism. They're trying to add to their toolbox in whatever it is they do for a living. And I've seen so many people successfully do that. Community development workers, architects, landscape architects, gardeners, foresters, furniture makers, huge range of different people who find use for permaculture in what they do, whilst it's also enhancing the fact that they like to grow some of their own food and so on. And I suppose one of the biggest challenges for me in all of this is that people want it to be about growing food. And that was the starting point, permanent agriculture. But it rapidly became apparent that it needed to be permaculture as permanent culture. I think Rennie Meyer-Slay sums this up well in the introduction to permaculture, which she gathered for Bill later on. And that we need financial systems that support what we're trying to do. We need ways of engaging and trading with others. We need communication systems that enable us. Bill called it, let's stop networking and start work netting. And lots and lots of clever observations have been made in this process, which means that what we now have is a toolbox that's full of questions, not answers. So what we're trying to teach people is, given any situation, what questions do you need to ask that will lead you to the answer? And one of the first rules of permaculture is there are no rules, because what I teach is, here's some words that you could usefully flush down the sink. Should, ought, must, right, wrong, good, bad. So should, ought, must is like a sense of obligation. This is the monkey sitting on your shoulders, digging his claws in, and you tense up, and then you feel obligated, And that takes us back to how we were taught in the 1950s, 1960s, and it's wrong. It's unliberating. That's not to say that you should be without morals or ethics or scruples, but do them because they fit you and you want to do them, not because somebody tells you you have to. Good and bad, what's good for me might be bad for you. What's good for Wednesday might be wrong for Saturday. What's good at the North Pole might be slightly different from what's good at the equator, and so on. And right and wrong are value judgments in the same way. So what we're trying to teach people to do is to be confident in designing systems that are as near to permanent as we can get, that endure, that are sustainable, and that work with what we have. Noticing what we don't have. If we need something else, then we need to consider, will I learn to do that myself? Will I build it myself? Or will I ask somebody to help me? So this is not about self-sufficiency. It's about how close to self-sufficiency can we get at a community level.
Yeah.
But see, I like to eat oranges and bananas, and I have no intention of stopping. I can grow oranges and bananas in Scotland, but the energy cost is ridiculous. So let's import oranges and bananas. But we can grow asparagus here. One thing I won't eat is Peruvian asparagus grown in the high Andes. What a wonderful culture they've created. They've built schools and hospitals and medical centers for all these people who are living high up on a plateau and using 4,000-year-old fossil groundwater. As Bill said, the person who uses groundwater in the desert is a temporary resident, where do we go? COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. What does Sharm el-Sheikh exist on? 40,000-year-old groundwater out of the Aravar, one of the most unsustainable places on the world. And you go there and it's full of swimming pools. It's just ridiculous. Why can't people see this? Well, because they haven't been through this process of learning. Another aspect that's very important in all of this is to understand that we are all always learning. I learn something every day. And I tell people the day you don't learn something is probably the first symptom of death. And I mean it, because science is not exact. If we go back to the herbalists, what happened after that was that people started to categorize, make scientific discoveries, and a lot of the early work was done by ministers of the cloth, reverends, because they had the time and the education. So, all they had to do was turn up on the Sunday and conduct services. Maybe there was the odd service in a week they would do. Maybe they were visiting the sick and the poor. But take Gilbert White of Selborne and his work. He was combining archaeology with natural science, because as he went around his parish, he just noticed all these things all the time. And that is the starting point of permaculture, being observant and noticing. So one of the first things we teach people is notice what's going on. When people come and see the garden here, which you mentioned earlier, I don't explain it to them. I ask them to have a walk around and come back and tell me what they notice. And then we have a conversation about what matters to them, because the garden speaks for itself. When we taught a course for people in food poverty in the town of Hawick in South Scotland here, we did so at the Salvation Army Citadel, and they have a charity shop there. And we now have a community garden there behind the charity shop, which belongs to the people of that town. Over time, we realized that we were teaching a lot more than how to tackle food poverty. And a lot of the people who come along to the courses are not in food poverty, but the lieutenant, who is the senior person in the Citadel, she came on the course as much as she could. And the fourth week we were doing this, it ran across 10 weeks. The fourth week we were doing this, she turned up the following week and said that Sunday she had taught a sermon on observation, because she had been so blown away by practicing it suddenly noticing all the plants that were growing in the middle of town that were edible, that she'd never thought of before, and so on. And it's that kind of influence that we have to people. We're lighting the blue touch paper and letting people fly off, and that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to inspire people. It doesn't need to be the case that people learn endless lists of facts. So what that generation of natural philosophers did, as they called themselves, was they got people into the idea of citizen science. And then some of them went on and became, Avogadro's hypothesis and all that sort of stuff. So many of the people who were early inventors, if you like, of chemistry, discoverers of chemistry, however you want to look at it, were again ministers. But think about your own education in the conventional system. When you go to nursery, they tell you a couple of things that are slightly educational. You get into primary school, they start teaching you a little bit of science. By the time of primary one, you're getting sort of bite-sized pieces. Right? When you go to primary 8 here, by primary 8, they're telling you what you learnt in primary 3 isn't actually so. It's like this instead. Then you go to secondary school, and it all happens again. And we've got a ridiculous system here where in second year of secondary school, children are starting to decide their careers, because that's when they're obliged to make the first choices of which exams they'll do 3 years later. It's just nonsense. And we should go for a baccalaureate system, if anything, like the French do and so on. So much of Europe does, where you get credits for what you do. And all the way through that process, you keep being told what you were taught before isn't actually how it is. When I was at Oxford, there were people studying chemistry, and chemistry had been streets ahead of everywhere else at Oxford in the 1960s. In the 1970s, it was streets behind everywhere else, because they'd made all these major discoveries and moved on. And at that time, we were getting into wave theory and so on. Now we can start to look at things and really question what we know as to it's the best possible explanation we have at the moment. It doesn't mean it's correct, So, for example, what are we made of? Well, we're told we're made of X% water, whatever it is, Then we discover that actually we are an entire community of living creatures. We are filled with so many other living creatures that make us work, bacteria in particular, So we're a host. We're not a living organism. We're a host organism. And then when we think about it, think about how atoms and molecules are made. Now, I'm living in Coldstream. If I was a hydrogen atom to scale here, the nucleus would be about the size of a soccer ball. World Cup going on at the moment. Football, yeah? The electron circling me, would be 8 miles away. What's that? 10 kilometers or something. And it would be the size of a tennis ball. And in between is nothing. So we are mostly made of nothing at all.
That's right.
So I'm still convinced once we've got it and believe it enough, we'll be able to walk through walls, because so little of us actually that exists, and so this just constantly tells us that we know so little. I'm working with Dr. Laningham's Soil Food Web and the Soil Food Web School at the moment, and she's done amazing work over the years, but the first person who really started this process was a Canadian female who was the first person to really point out about living soil and how trees talk to each other and so on. This really only began to be understood in 1997. By 1999, it had moved on. And today we're still discovering things,
Do you think that's
so recent,
Yeah. I feel somehow that permaculture is in quite an expansive learning process at the moment, connecting in with researchers like Dr. Laningham and others, that redescribing the kinds of lessons that people are sharing out through understanding science better, understanding science differently. And I wondered whether you might reflect on how you'd seen permaculture shift and change over the decades you've been involved, and where you feel like it can or could possibly open further in your understanding where we could take it, or where you feel that we need to take it.
Interesting. I'm very busy at the moment, and I didn't really have time, but I've just helped a chap finish his diploma here. I did the senior tutor bit of reassessing what his actual tutor had done with him. And the reason I volunteered to do it is that he lives in Richmond in Yorkshire, which is where I went to school from secondary year up to fifth year. And I have very happy memories of living in the Yorkshire Dales and Swaledale in particular. And so I kind of felt an obligation to give something back for that. Stephen has done amazing work. He's got a wonderful website with his diploma on it. It's called the Pollen Gardens. And anybody wants to look, have a look. But I found that as I was reading it, I was very struck by the fact that he was giving a very literal interpretation of everything having to be permaculture, and of the principles as stated by David, very specifically. And I was very pleased that he welcomed me to have a conversation with him after we'd finished the whole process, which it wasn't things that I particularly wanted to write to him. And I just suggested that it was time he made this his own. And don't, feel free to break the rules, feel free to change things, feel free to write your own principles. And he started a local organization, and has ought to be all about permaculture. And I said, please throw that out the window. It can be about anything you want. It's not what we call things. I've had people talk to me about, oh, that's not permaculture, that's agroforestry, or is it forest gardening or food forests or agroforestry or
syntropic?
No, syntropic is where I was coming to. Oh, yeah, no, syntropics is developed from permaculture. It's much better. Well, syntropics is really about alley cropping. It's just another technique. And yes, it's derived from permaculture, but I don't see anything in syntropics about energy efficiency in buildings or what we do to the water table, particularly, So it's not the labels that matter. It's what we are doing and what we are not doing. So when you make a design, if it isn't producing what you have consciously designed it to do, then revisit the design and either change what you're doing or just stop. One of the things I discovered working with young people in the Prince's Trust is one of the most rewarding things you can say to people is it's okay to stop. Because when people try things and they don't work, they get in a tiz about it. What am I doing wrong? Well, don't worry about it. Worrying doesn't change anything. If you're worried about something, you can either change it or you can't. If you can't change it, there's no point worrying about it, because that just makes you ill. If you can change it, change it. If you can't change it, but you think somebody else can, ask them. That's end of worrying. And with all the tidal waves we face right now, which aren't going away anytime soon, climate change, mass extinction, pollution of our continental shelves, which harvest more carbon dioxide and produce more oxygen than all the trees on planet Earth, half of which we've already cut down, and there's a good deal more burning, and we're not slowing down the rate of deforestation. This is just idiotic. Wonderful piece on the BBC on Sunday about the tree planting program they started. They've now planted, people across the UK, 850,000 trees. That's one tree for every 73 people in the UK. We're not even scratching the surface here. So permaculture, I think, had from the outset, certainly from the designer's manual onwards, in it just about everything it's got in it today. I don't think so. There was an international teachers meeting in Leeds in Yorkshire a couple of years back, and somebody looked at my books and said, "Oh, you wrote this in 1990. Gosh, you must have been a lone voice in the wilderness then." I said, "Well, no, but there's a few more interested today." And often I avoided using the word permaculture. I wouldn't have called it the permaculture garden, for example, when that happened. I would have called it Recreating Eden, but as the publisher, I had the right to set the title. And I didn't have spare time or energy to be my own publisher and all that stuff, you know. So I think what has changed is we have much better skills in the teaching base. And there are still the odd person in different parts of the world who think teaching means sitting people behind a desk and talking at them. You know, and I hope people learn from that. I know people who've done courses like that who come away enthusing about it. But what I think people like Robin Clayfield and yourself and Rosemary Morrow and bring to the party, Delvin Solkinson, is a completely different approach. We are not teachers, we are facilitators of learning. Adult education is a very different thing from school, and we have different habits, different skills, different attention span. But everybody who comes into your classroom on a permaculture design course brings with them all the knowledge they have gained and experience they've gained through life. Nobody walks through that door an empty vessel waiting to be filled with your immense wisdom. What you are there to do is to inspire them. And let me put it like this. A lot of people know how to drive. Not everybody, of course. My experience of learning to drive was very interesting. I learned to drive in central London, not as bad as Tel Aviv or Bangkok or somewhere like that, but it's still pretty scary. The first day we went driving, my instructor took me down a street market. There's rows of stalls each side of the street. I've seen similar things in Melbourne, for example, in Australia. And people just walk randomly across the road in front of you. And I've never driven a car before. Not true, I've driven a tractor before, but, And I get to the bottom of this steep hill, and, I've got sweat patches under my arms and I'm shaking. And he turns around to me and says, "Okay," he said, "it never gets any worse than that." Well, what a gift. The guy is sharing with me extremes right from the outset. Be prepared, So you'll be safe later on. Later on, at the end of our time together, he took me to the top of Herne Hill in South London, to a very steep hill about half a mile long, and said, "Okay, the brakes have failed. I'm going to show you how to stop the car." And he let me stop his car by crashing it through the gears down the hill, which meant that if that ever happens to me, I know what to do. Yeah. But what's going on? We're learning to drive. No, we're not. We're learning to pass the driving test. Yeah. So in a way, doing the diploma is a bit similar. Certainly doing the design courses like that. You come out of a design course, all you've got is a sort of set of notes to say, right, go off and try a few things, That's why it has to be 2 years since the design course before you get a diploma in any system I know of. Most people take longer than that, When you passed your driving test, that's when you start to learn to drive, because now you're released on the real world and you discover what's really going on. And this can be crazy. In this country, my wife took her driving test here in 1989 in the town called Kelso, just near where we are. At that time, Kelso had no pedestrian crossings, no traffic lights, and no roundabouts. And she passed her test there. She could have driven in the middle of London the following day, legitimately, and she wouldn't have had a clue what to do. Now they've changed it. So when you're a learner, you're now allowed to drive on the motorways with an instructor, so that when you passed your test, you know what to expect, So we learn over time. But permaculture is exactly like that. All we're ever doing is playing around with things, learning the ropes, and then we go out into the real world and we have a shot.
So I wanted to ask you then about becoming a teacher. So the process that you would take people through. So coming from your approach, how do you guide people through that process of your courses to become a permaculture teacher, and how important do you think the process of the diploma is to enter into that teaching space? Like what makes a good you've described what makes a good teacher, but how do you teach people to become a teacher? Like, what is your train the trainer course include, if it's not just full of questions then? Or maybe it is.
Well, I know those are two very good questions themselves. So the first thing we do is we invite the participants to create the course culture. And there's a number of different ways you can do this. I'm just 3/4 away through a forest gardening course teaching with Thomas Remiarts at the moment. And he led this process using a Jamboard. We just get people to write on Post-its and we stick them on. And then when we've got all that, you can then start to arrange it into topic areas. And eventually, if you want, you can turn that into a mind map and so on. The beauty about mind maps is you can play with them more than once. And if it doesn't work as well as you want the first time, well, just redo it, But it's this connecting of ideas in the spatial way our brain works, not in a linear fashion. Yeah, that's a key part of what we're trying to teach people. The second we get that done, we have different ways of using it. Rakesh Bambri, who I train trainers with, he has a process where he makes a page with columns on, and it says seed, shooting, flowering, shooting, leafing, flowering, fruiting, so using a botanical analogy, so that each time we look at this chart, people are invited to put the pointer which column they think that item is in. So listening well would be one of the things that people commonly come up with. Having time to think, not interrupting, turning up on time. These are the kind of things that people come up with, but it's their culture, they create it. Now, when I started doing this, I started handing out a protocol to people and saying, this is what we'll do. And I've learned that getting people to make their own culture is a much better process because they then own it. And one of the rules using Rakesh process is no Post-it goes further up the scale than the person who's least happy with it. So my phrase is the convoy moves at the speed of the slowest ship. So what we're doing is we're respecting the person who's least happy with where we've got to it. And that's what we'll be addressing in our concerns. We try not to get diverted in lessons into debates about issues, because this curriculum is so vast that in the time available to us, we want to make sure that in a teaching session, we do what we're there to teach. But we also make sure there are lots of spaces in the timetable. Some of them are deliberate bufferage points. So I'll put something in the timetable and it doesn't say bufferage point. It says something fairly innocuous. But it's deliberately there because that doesn't imply a lot of content. So if we overrun on something, or if people don't get it, we've got a space we can come back to it. So we also have a document called a mystery, or there's a pun on mystery, you see, or parking lot, some people call this. And if something comes up and it's off topic and we don't want to get diverted, we make sure it goes in there. We're commonly teaching people of different language ability, and often English is not their first language, although we're teaching in English. I have taught in French, but I'm not brilliant at it. That's because I turned up at West Africa and the translator spoke Spanish, not English. So my French isn't bad, but I'm rubbish at all these complicated French tenses, and I don't have the technical vocabulary to the same extent. Well, the Africans forgive me for tenses because they don't bother about them either. And I had a friend and I had a dictionary, so we got by. But we were also contemporaneously translating into 9 languages. Well, 4 whilst I was talking, and then stopping every 10 minutes to do the other 5. And then you had to stop every day for prayers 5 times, and you had to stop at midday because it was 50 degrees, and you're still teaching.
It's a different world, isn't it? I'm taught often through translators, and it's a very, very different world.
Indeed. So anyway, so I try and have a volunteer from the course who is recording words that people struggle with. And so we have a multilingual table where we give the translations of each of these words, and if necessary, we share an explanation of it, and that can be done on a board or a sheet of paper on the wall or something. If you're in situ doing things online, you can just put all these things into a Google Docs folder and so on. When we're doing it online, we record everything so that people can go back and see it again, because there's always somebody who had to go to the doctors or pick up Johnny from school or something. And sometimes it just helps to be able just to see the thing over again, because one of the things you'll notice when you're teaching is sometimes people aren't listening because they've been listening so well. The last thing that happened is still going around in their head, so they're not hearing the next thing that happens because of that. So one of the things we teach teachers is say everything twice. Repeat yourself. What did I just do? And that's very important. I think people sometimes think, oh no, I already said that, but actually repetition is a key part of learning, and reiteration. So at the end of every session, we're always asking people, how are you? At the end of every day, we have a review session, and every following morning, we have a review session. When we're training teachers, we make the case that they end up teaching the course. So we start by leading these kind of sessions, and then we put people into pairs, and every day one pair will open the day, one pair will close the day. Another thing that we do is we ask people to teach a pattern in pairs when we're doing the PDC. You can do that in a teacher training, but usually I find we don't have time. We don't spend much time in a teacher training course teaching the curriculum.
No.
We assume people already have to know that. What we're teaching is teaching.
Yeah.
And so when we have these review sessions, you try and encourage people to use different questions. So, how are you this morning? Okay, but I've been asked that 14 times, it starts to wear a bit thin. So you invite people to be creative about that. If you were a bird this morning, what kind of bird would you be? If you were a water source, a water feature, what kind of water feature would you be? And it gets people to think about being creative and illustrative, painting word pictures, which engages people, and often can be more expressive than inviting people just to tell you what's going on in their lives.
Yeah. With the word pictures, it made me think of, which is something that you obviously weave in a lot to how you teach, is storytelling. So can you speak a bit about how you share storytelling? Like, how do you help to cultivate storytelling? Because some people say, I can't tell stories. But how do you encourage people into that space? Because it's one of the things that I find the most powerful in terms of actually getting things to land.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got a 3-stage process, and it goes like this. The first thing is day one. Rakesh says, I want you to tell us the story of your name. And you've got 2 minutes. Go. And we just go around the room and everybody does it. And you'd be amazed, because people go, I haven't prepared for this. He said, okay, well, I can start, he says, and off he goes, or whatever, And it's really interesting because everybody knows something about their name. And so it's something they know. It's about them. And they're just talking. And we get through all of that. And he says, okay, that's great. That was all wonderful, wasn't it? The next stage in the process, which comes a couple of days later, probably, is we produce a series of topics, and we tell everybody they've got 2 minutes. You can make it more or less. More is better, but call it 2 minutes to teach this topic. Might be 5 minutes if you want, but not long, And you tell them what the topics are, and you make a list, and you invite them to tick the one they want to do. And you say, if there's not something there you want to do, just tell us and we'll find something else. So we're not applying pressure. This is the thing. Because the main thing you're trying to teach people is to be confident. Most of the people who come on a teaching course know plenty to teach, but what they're lacking is confidence. And of course, it differs from person to person. Some people are straight into it and away they go, And you will be cut off at the end. If you run out of time, you'll be stopped. So we're getting them to think about timing things. And it's interesting what people come up with. Originally, we just asked people to suggest a subject, and we find that people were doing things that weren't really much to do with permaculture. So we kind of narrowed it down. So it might be something very simple. It might say succession, or it might say Coriolis effect, or which is more complicated, or it might say your favorite tree. But whatever it is, they get into this. And by the time they've all been through this, and you can do it, if we've got time, we do it twice for each person. Some people fail to put their names down. Some people are too nervous about it. So you just have to keep encouraging people. And and then the third thing is they get 15 minutes to teach a lesson. Now, one of the things that you instantly come across to this is, of course, people tend to teach lessons that are an hour or whatever. But if you've got 24 people in a room, you're not going to sit there for 24 hours listening to lessons over and over. So 15 minutes is what they get. And we again set topics these days. We used to just allow people to pick a topic, but again we say, if there's not something here that you want to do and you want to talk about it, that's fine. Some of the very best ones are people who do a practical demonstration of something. So we've had people grafting a fruit tree, we've had people binding a book, we've had people making soap. So these practical demonstration things are great because it's very visual, and they're explaining how to do something. Other people will talk about a theory or a process or a pattern. I remember one person talking about the people process of designing a community garden in India, and you get some really interesting stuff. And other people, are more challenging. They'll bring up things that are quite interesting and in different ways, and overlap between yoga and permaculture, or Buddhism and permaculture, or something like that. Things that people care about themselves.
I was going to ask you about whether you encourage people in these short sections to show very clearly how, say, soap making relates to the permaculture ethics or principles.
Oh yes, that's an essential part of it, because we've gone through lots of other lessons about ethics and principles and so on, and how you would include them and so on. So it's not done in isolation; it's part of a main course. And I can share a timetable with you if you want, so you can see it yourself. Yeah. But just stepping back from that to where we were before, about this beginning and end of the day, these questions get phrased very differently. And again, we invite people to make creative ways of asking them. But one of the things we're always trying to find out is what went well for you. So what did you take away from yesterday's lesson that you were, awake at night and suddenly thought, wow. So did you have any amazing insights afterwards into anything? And was there something that you didn't get or want to hear more about?
Yeah.
And try to make it so that every day we have guild time. So we put people into guilds, and we ask them if they want to choose their own guilds, and we ask them if they want to, or they want to be appointed to a guild. And we always say to people, if you don't like the guild you're in, just say, and we'll change it. And that nobody gets thought badly of if they say that. It needs to work for you that you're with a group of people you get on with. And just occasionally we have people who say, I'd rather be with somebody else or whatever. And once we had a woman who dropped out and refused to do guilds at all. She got offended about something very silly, really. But that's where she was at, and she didn't do a design at the end, so she didn't get a certificate. If she turns up one day with a design, I'll give her a certificate, But that's an absolute. You have to attend 80% of 72 hours on the PDC, so we go with that for the training of teachers. You have to be there 80% of the time, and you have to do the presentations.
Yeah.
If you're mindful, you get to do 2 of the end presentations. So and guild time. Well, online we use breakout rooms constantly. So every now and then we just send people into breakout rooms. Might be for 2 minutes, might be for 10 minutes. There's a listening exercise you can do where you send people in pairs into breakout rooms, and they all have to listen to each other for 2 minutes. Oh, that's the other thing we do with course culture, is we do that with either breakout rooms or pairs in a room or whatever. And we ask each person to listen to the other person for 2 minutes, and then to come back and tell us what the other person said, not the person tell you what they said. And the 2 questions, one very good experience of learning and one poor experience of learning. And that, when you do it with a whole group of people, gives you most of the things you'd want to say about what works well and what doesn't work well. Typically, I didn't get listened to. I got put down. The guy didn't know what he was talking about and couldn't transmit it, just mumbled away, or was just reading from notes, or all the things that you would want people not to do in a classroom. Or they favoured certain people in the room. And that's one of the issues when you're doing these kind of courses. There are always some people who are more willing to put their hands up. And I try to make sure we don't make it a direct confrontation. But one of the ways you can do that is, instead of just asking people to put their hands up, you then select people that you want to feed back. So if you're getting an overbalance in one direction, you just start asking the people who haven't spoken, how do you feel about this? But you have to do it in a way that's not pressuring people.
Not confrontational, that's right.
You have to make it an invitation, And so every day we will always do at least one go round of everybody, and preferably twice a day. Depends how we're doing for time.
Yeah. How long are your courses, like on Zoom? Do you find that they're shorter on Zoom because people get Zoom fatigue, or do you just spread them out longer?
Well, they are shorter. What we've settled at with training of teachers is 2 days a week for 7 weeks. That's right. Yeah. And we would typically be running, the forest gardening course I'm doing online at the moment is 11 till 4. So people turn up for 11. We start teaching at 11:30. We take half an hour for lunch, and we finish at 4. 11 to 11:30 is open for people to come and socialise, chat, share time. It also helps make sure people get there on time. And at 4, we leave it open. If people want to stay, they can stay and chat for another half hour. And sometimes when you're doing the guild stuff, people say, we want to meet with our guild at the end. Is that okay? Yeah, we just leave it open and let them go talk to each other. I find that not too many times a week. I have done it three times in a week. I find that's difficult for me, not because I get worn out, because I've got too many other things to do in a week, but that seems to work. And the present course, which is forest gardening in 4 days, 3 days so far, people have just said at the end, it's wonderful, I've learned lots.
Yeah, right.
It's made me think differently. That's what you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that about your courses. What do you see as being what you hope people are going to go out into the world and do with their permaculture education and permaculture teacher training? Like, what are the things that you kind of send them off and encourage them to do? I know there's so many multiplicity of ways that they can apply this lens of thinking, but it feels to me that in our world today, permaculture is something that is so important. And have you changed the way that you're sending people out into the world at the end, or is it, maybe not? As I'm asking you this question, I'm thinking we've talked about this since the beginning of permaculture. I remember talking about exactly these same things, but somehow it feels like the pressure is on now.
People often ask me what my expectations are, and I try to live without expectations. I used to be an optimist, and I found I was often disappointed. So I became a pessimist, and now I'm pleasantly surprised from time to time. And humor is a very important part of teaching too. So I've got a PowerPoint I'll share with you, which is about goal setting. So I like people to do that at the end before they go away on a course. If we haven't got time to do it, I share it with them and they can do it in their own time. It's just walking people step through. What are you going to do here? So we use the standard permaculture thing of what went well, what would you do differently, what's the big picture, and what are your next steps? So we use that as a standard with people. You asked about what's the permaculture way bit about. The way it's about how you think, and just to sidetrack slightly, when I wrote the permaculture garden, it was because people kept saying, oh, you mean like organic gardening? And I kept saying, no, it's a design system. And in the end, I saw the light and I thought, if people wanted to be about gardening, let's make it a portal. So the permaculture garden is clearly explained in the introduction. It's really about using gardening as a paradigm. And I know Jeff Lawton's fond of saying everything you want to learn about life, you can learn in a garden. Some people say it was a Billism, but I don't know. Don't mind. These things are for sharing. Mm-hmm. I believe very heartily in Creative Commons, which I know you're brilliant at, Morag, that what's going on with the world is too important for us to be holding on to things, anything that's on my website, anything that's on my Facebook page, whatever, it's all shareware, if it belonged to me. If it belonged to somebody else, it says so. I use B6 or something it's called, which is you're welcome to use this free. Only you agree not to charge for it yourself, and you're welcome to edit it and change it to suit yourself. But we do ask that you give credit to whoever you're borrowing from, period, And, when you look at the work that so many people have done voluntarily over so many years to move this whole thing forward, it's quite chastening. And, who are my heroes, you asked earlier? Well, I think a very recent one is Robin Wall Kimmerer. I think Braiding Sweetgrass is one of my favourite books ever. I've got about 4,000 books in the house here, so I've got quite a few favourite books. But I've also got 400 kilos of apples, if you know anybody who wants apples. Edward de Bono, especially Six Coloured Thinking, Six Coloured Hats.
I liked his the happiness. What was that? Where the hand? Do you remember that one? And each finger was something about like direction, and I wish I could remember them now. But there's one of the books that I use often about that. And then I've added an extra one into his, and it's about joining together the hands in community. And De Bono, my dad, when I was about 19, sent me off to go and do some training with De Bono. And I was so thankful to him because I've used it in all of the courses that I've done. It's so useful.
Well, the particular thing, coming back to the science question again, so, white is facts. Today it's the 22nd of November. It's 11:45 where I am. Green is about brainstorming, open thinking, coming up with ideas. Yellow is about the benefits of doing something. Black is about, given those benefits, what is a realistic reconsideration of the facts and situation. It's not about what's wrong with something. It's about realistic assessment. That's one thing people often get wrong. And red is about how do you feel about things. And blue is about what we're doing now, which is thinking about thinking. Along with open questions, I think this is one of the most important things for people to understand, because it allows us to manage our thinking and how we think, and that's what De Bono made a career out of. And one of the brilliant things about it is that, unlike many brilliant people, he just talks in very plain English. There are so many clever Maltese I've met in my life. I lived in Malta for 3 years. I always take my hat off to these kind of guys. And, what's it, doctorate from Cambridge, doctorate from Harvard, and just a common man. When he was asked by the Foreign Office in the UK what he should do to create peace in the Middle East, he said, send them Marmite. Vegemite, if you like, because the vitamins in it calm you down, Clever man. But the important point here for me is this thing about red thinking, people talk about emotional intelligence these days, another contribution to the debate. In the scientific community, I heard so many times that rational is good and being emotional is not. But emotional is a form of intelligence just as much as rational is, in fact, sometimes more so. I don't know if you've ever done that thing of interviewing people for a job and you get a checklist and you're supposed to tick the boxes, and then we get to the end of the process and the people say, actually, I preferred him.
That's right.
You just throw away the piece of paper and go with your gut instincts. Learn to. So in all of this, by the way, one of the things I thank people for mostly is listening. So if anybody's listening to this, thank you for listening, because listening is much harder work than talking. And when you're being taught, you find it's in imbalance. So you have to spend more time listening to people than you get listened to. So it's very important that people recognize from the outset how important that is. Roger Phillips, the guy who made all these amazing books of plants and animals and so on, one of the first people to pioneer exhaustive photography of different things. So his book Wild Food is one of the very best books on foraging, and every plant has got recipes with it as well. He and De Bono both passed away this year, similarly getting on for 90 and around that age. Who else? Well, Bill Mollison, David Holmgren, Rosemary Morrow in particular. Delvin Solkinson just posted a whole thing in praise of me the other day, which I'm quite embarrassed about, really. But, Delvin and Grace are wonders in their own land. And whilst Delvin is often the person at the front there, they are really a team. And they're some of the most organised people on planet Earth that I know, but always make it sound easy, which it isn't. Well, a lot of my real heroes are just very ordinary people. And I, teaching the soil food web stuff at the moment, was talking to a guy who chairs the charity they support in Malawi, who's based in England. And he said, is Vandana Shiva teaching on this course? And I said, well, not at the moment. No, I don't know Vandana Shiva. I know how wonderful she is and all the rest of it. But, don't you? Oh, I said, oh, she should. I said, well, you're welcome to ask her if she wants. But, you know, the more that as teachers we're superheroes, the less enabling that is for other people.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that thing of modesty and humility is a key part of being a good teacher. We're not here because we're cleverer than you. We're just here because we were here before you, and we value this discipline so much that we want to share it as widely as we can, as often as we can. And like Rosemary Morrow, you know, find it difficult to stop.
Yes, I know. I have her latest book. Yes, yeah. I helped them to. It's one of the things I really love about the work that we're doing, is able to contribute to the publishing of books like that, and the film that Dan Palmer was working on with David Holgram before he passed. So I hope that film gets finished too. There's a lot of really good works in the flow. So hopefully that.
Yeah. So well, that was a tragic loss too. Yeah, far too young, and very sad. But yeah, the trouble is, you know, I'll be 70 next year, and I've made a commitment to keep going for the next 12 months, and then I'll see where I end up then. I'm hoping to teach in Derry in Northern Ireland, which is one of the crux points of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I am 36% Irish myself in my DNA, and I was brought up as a Catholic, and that's, you know, why Derry was a crux point, because it's a Catholic-dominated town. But there was a bomb there again yesterday.
Oh, was there? I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, somebody was kidnapped and made to drive his car to a police station, and there was some sort of explosion going on. They had to clear the district and so on. And interestingly, Sinn Féin came out and said, "You're living the past. This past is gone. You know, this is not okay."
Yeah. Good.
So, you know, hopefully people are moving on. But you see, when you have such inequalities and injustices as happened in Ireland across centuries, you know, and a lot of people forget that actually the English were invited in by the kings of Ireland, who were squabbling amongst themselves. But, you know, Cromwell's occupation and the, you know, the Black and Tans and the Easter Rising and so on, it's a horrific story. And how do you forget these things? I mean, on the plane to Australia, I watched an entire series. I think it was called Murray River, was it? It's about the first settlers and how they treated or mistreated Aboriginal people. And I didn't sleep all the way from Scotland to Perth, so I watched the whole series between going there and coming back. And I just thought how awful it is, because we can never repair that damage. We can, and although, you know, you and I didn't do it, you know, we still feel a sense of guilt that our ancestors did to some extent. And, you know, and it's just, how do we in this world forgive and move on? And it's not easy. It's not easy at all.
I hosted a masterclass the other week, as people were saying, well, what has permaculture got to do with Indigenous cultures? And is permaculture just a way of a new form of colonization? And so I said, well, let's ask people. So I invited a whole group of people who are involved in some way in permaculture, but are also Indigenous themselves. And we had a yarning about permaculture. And one of those people is Dominic Chen, who's a member of our institute, and she's working currently on developing a whole series of content that she can share with permaculture teachers around the world to talk about these issues and how to communicate them. And so it's not about, you know, it's about rising together. How can we come, you know, beautifully together? There's a lot of intersection that's happening here with the permaculture community and Indigenous communities, which, you know, from the cool burnings to the work of Bruce Pascoe, to Indigenous women's natural food programs and all kinds of things. So it's really encouraging in that way, and I find it's a really wonderful space in which to engage in the healing.
Yeah, I would have added Bruce Pascoe and Dark Emu alongside Robin Wall Kimmerer in, heroes. And one of the things that's lovely about Bruce is, again, his tone. He's not calling names. He's not blaming anybody. It's just so well written from that point of view, and just saying, here's what you missed.
Yeah.
So I'm very keen that we've got people from Indigenous communities involved in the online PDC I'm making just now, and I'm hopeful that I'm going to get some good information about Aboriginal practices and contributions. I was very disappointed in 2016 not to have more connection with Aborigines. There were a few turned up at the showgrounds when there was an open day, and there was one guy there I had long conversations with who was an Aboriginal but looked white. But he said, you get accepted and told if you're an Aboriginal, and I'm told I'm an Aboriginal. He was very interesting about it. And Nancy and I went to the place in Queensland where there's an Aboriginal arts centre just below Atherton Tablelands for an evening. And I had fallen and twisted my ankle, and one of them kindly took me around in a wheelchair. It's actually quite a long distance to walk. And I had a long chat with him, and he was all daubed up and all the rest of it to do the stage show and so on. And I found it very difficult. And he said, I've been here 15 years and I've had enough. And I actually, although it's run by Aborigines and funded by the state of Queensland, I found it very difficult because I felt it was still kind of patronising in some way. And I thought, I'm not sure if I was you, I'd enjoy doing this at all, and then you go up onto the Atherton Tablelands, and it's like being in Hampshire, totally turned over. And one of the people I'm working with is a guy called James Atherton, whose great-grandfather
good friend
was named for. And more diversity. James is a lovely guy and very clued up, and he's just doing his diploma with me at the moment. So,
great. Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited that here in Australia we have the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and the Indigenous voice in Parliament is now with our new Prime Minister. Is that going to start to get in? And there'll be truth-telling and voice in Parliament and treaty heading towards that. And it's kind of unbelievable that now we are here in 2022 and that we're only just doing that now. But it's a really positive step forward. Look, Graham, thank you so much. We've been talking for 2 hours. I should let you go now. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your perspective on ways that we can share permaculture out into the world and how we can ground it, how we can bring it into our daily life and our daily practice and just be calm and present with it. I think, that's kind of, I get this great sense of calmness about how you share it into the world.
Just tell stories, really.
Yes.
And that's the one great thing that people get very soon in training of teachers is get good at telling stories. Avoid jargon, just chat with people, and make it easy for them to do the same.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to this very special and extended episode of Sense Making the Changing World, celebrating Graham Bell, who passed away earlier this month, too soon. As you heard, he had much left that he was planning to do with permaculture education, and I hope you will join me in carrying on the permaculture teaching candle. Take care of you and your loved ones. I'll catch you next time.